What's up, everybody? So, about last month, Cavalry announced that they will be hosting the 36 Days of Type challenge over on their Instagram. If you don't know what Cavalry is, it's a 2D animation software making waves in the world of motion design for its ability to create beautiful procedural animation through the use of code, design, and animation. I've been wanting to experiment with Cavalry for a while now, so I thought to myself, perhaps the first day of the challenge might be a great opportunity to actually use the software and try it out. After going through the documentation and playing around, I ended up with a 10-second typography animation of the letter A. And in this video, I'm going to talk through the process of creating this. Maybe you'll pick up a thing or two, or perhaps be inspired to try out the software for yourself. Let's get into it. So this is not a tutorial by any means, so I would totally understand if there's some things I point to or click at that you don't fully understand what's going on there. If you're interested in using the software to create procedural animations, I definitely recommend checking out Cavalry's YouTube channel. Alright, let's dive into it. So the first thing I did here, as you can see, I have things separated into like foreground and background. My background right now is where I have these lines showing up, wavy like lines, whereas my foreground is actually the letter A. Let's dive into the background. So the background is pretty straightforward. Okay, so the first thing I'm doing here is adding a line. Before I move forward, there's something important to understand about Cavalry. Cavalry has these key concepts. I definitely recommend taking a look at your documentation in order to get a deeper understanding of how those work. But in Cavalry, there are like there are about 4 main layers you can add. You can add shapes, you can add behaviors, you can add utilities, and you can add effects. Shapes are just your typical shape, background shape, line, duplicated shapes. You can add all sorts of shapes. Behaviors are pretty much what you use to sort of like deform or manipulate shapes in an interesting way to get like an interesting look. Utilities, I'm not too familiar with utilities yet, but effects are pretty much just your typical effects, like blur, distortion, chromatic aberration, anything to add an effect on your existing motion graphic. So I added a basic line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable all of that just to show you, and I'm going to enable just the line. So you can see I started off with just an empty line, and then the next thing I did was I deformed the line. So if I double click on this line, my attribute editor is going to open up just like in DaVinci Resolve, where you have like your inspector. So I can basically manipulate like all the attributes that belong to this line. And if you take a look here at the basic line, what you're going to see is the position property, rotation, scale, all the transform properties are over here. See opacity, blend mode, but there's this interesting option here for deform. So you can add like a deformer to it, which is what we saw earlier, which is pretty much a behavior to your shape. How do you want your shape to behave? How do you want to deform your shape? If I double click that again, you would see that if I hover over here, I've added an oscillator to it so the line can oscillate. By plugging that in, I was able to get my oscillation look, which is what you see here. So I can disable that, enable, disable, enable, and you can see that oscillation right there. And the oscillation, you can have the strength. How strong do you want that oscillation to be? So if I increase that, you can see it's very strong. So I can just go and drop that back to 100%. You can take a look what type of oscillation you want, cosine, or do you want a tangent, or I'm fine with sine. And it gives you all these properties that you can use, all these attributes, I should call them, all these attributes that you can use to deform and sort of manipulate your shape in a very interesting way. And it's pretty cool. So with my oscillation added, and I played around with this, you can set it to whatever you want. You can add in a duplicator. So you can take a look there. My duplicator is off. So I add in the duplicator, and here it is. One thing that I just noticed that I'm slightly brushing over is how to add these things in. Essentially, you can add your shapes from here and you can add your behaviors from there. In order to connect them in Cavalry, essentially you have to use this connection, and you drag and then you drop. Essentially is how you do it. So you basically say I want to drag this on top of that, and then it will give you some options on where you want to connect that to. Sometimes for shapes too, you can click them and you can click this duplicator and it will just automatically apply the duplicator. But still as well, you'll need to like drag this into, for example, you can drag this oscillation into like the duplicator, and then you can choose, you know, what options there. But essentially that's what's going on. I have my, if I turn all of that off, I have my basic line. I add in a behavior to deform it using an oscillation deformer, and then I duplicate all those lines, and basically I get that. If I go to my duplicator here, you can see that what it's taken as an input shape is the basic line, the line that we've already deformed with oscillation. So yeah, that's pretty much what I did for my background. And now let's take a look at the foreground. The foreground is pretty interesting because that's pretty much the main animation. First thing I did for the foreground is pretty straightforward. I just added in like a text. I set the size that I want for my text. So I set the font size, I select the font type and the weight, whether it's regular or bold. I chose regular here. Don't get too overwhelmed by these options. They're sort of nicely categorized to some degree. Everything here, for example, is like related to transform. Here is related to like the layer itself, where the opacity, the blend mode, and then you notice the deformers and filters. Try not to get overwhelmed by the amount of attributes that you see. Just try to take a look and try to get a good understanding of what it is that you're trying to implement, and then you can proceed from there. So you can see here, I have this text that I've all set up here with letter A. The next thing that I did was I introduced a shape. So I have my letter A and I have my basic shape. Now, here's where things get kind of interesting, okay? You're gonna need to stay with me on this one. So now that I have these two in, the next thing I did was to duplicate my little shape. So I have my letter A, I have my basic shape. The next thing I did was to duplicate that shape. Once you apply a duplicator, by default, it's not gonna look like that. No. So if I go to the duplicator, by default, it's usually set to grid, and you can kind of set like, you can see here, how many rows and columns that you want. So like that. So it's typically like in the grid format, and it's like 3x3, let's say, right? Now, this property, this attribute called distribution, basically it's a way to tell Cavalry how you want to lay out that particular shape. Remember, the duplicator is using, so you have an input shape here. It's using this basic shape. I really should have named this properly, but it's using that small little square as the input. It takes that as the input, and then it basically duplicates that. And this distribute attribute tells us how to lay out that duplication. Do we lay it out in a grid format? Do we lay it out in a Fibonacci sequence? Do we lay it out in a particle? Do we lay it out in a circle? Do we lay it out as a rose? You can literally lay it out in any format that you want. But there's this interesting layout called voxelize. Voxelize is pretty cool because with voxelize, you're essentially using a custom layout. So if I do voxelize here, it's going to ask you to choose an input shape for it to use as the layout. So with the voxelize, it basically uses an input shape as the layout. So what did I do here? I set the input shape to letter A, to the text A. And because it uses that as the layout, it basically duplicates little tiny boxes all over the letter A. In order to get it to look like that, you need to play around with some values a little bit, like the size of the voxelize. So for example, if I reduce this to 0, I get more and more duplicates. If I make this number higher, I get less and less duplicates on the shape. So I found out that right about 32 is something that I was okay with. You also need to play around with the scale of the shape. So for example, I'm controlling each individual shape. If I go back to duplicator, you can see tiny shapes. 0.1, that's 1. If I do 0.2, which is what I like. So you can control the individual shapes if you want as well. I thought it would be cool to add in a nice shadow to the voxelized text. And after that, I introduced another behavior. So if I go back to the duplicate, you can see that there's this option for position. Another interesting thing to note is that anything that has this yellow sign is being driven by something else. And this is really the power of like Cavalry, in my opinion, is the fact that pretty much almost any attribute can be driven or directed by something else. I don't need to put keyframes for it to animate it. I can simply get it animated by using another value or using something else. So for example, this shape position, simply by right clicking, rather than controlling like the individual duplicates and animating all of that, which is a lot of work, you can right click and add a behavior. So how do you want your shape position to behave? And what I did was I added in random. Where's random? R for random. You can apply it simply on the X positions of the shape. So you control each individual like duplicate, or you can put it on the Y position, entirely up to you. I just put it on everything. I just put it on random, so both the X and Y. And right now I have it disabled. But if I enable it, disabled, enable, everything shows. You can see that it's scattered. So if we go to the behavior, let's see what's happening there. So you can control the strength, how effective that random is. I'm gonna leave it as 100%. I want to do very randomized. And there's some other things here, other properties here you can control. You can control the seed. What's the seed of that randomization? 0 is fine by me. There's also like the minimum and the maximum. You can play around with those and see the effect that you get. I believe like the minimum, the value is given to like the first duplicate, and then the maximum is given to like the last duplicate. Essentially, what I'm doing here is I've animated the minimum and the maximum to go to the original positions. So let me explain that more clearly. So you have the strength is 100%, you have the minimum 733, and you have the maximum this. So the minimum and maximum are very good values, because whenever Cavalry like makes a bunch of duplicates, it assigns minimum values. It assigns the minimum value to like the first duplicate, and the maximum value to the last duplicate, and everything else is in between. Each duplicate has a number in between, in this case 733 and -46, and so they're in random places. And I click like separate channels, so it does, does it differently for the X and for the Y as well. And essentially what I did here in order to get that animation is I started off with 0, but I think the animation lasts for 250 frames. So I started off with these numbers, minimum and maximum, and I animated it to here. So I put 0. So right about here, the minimum goes back to 0, maximum goes back to 0, which is essentially your initial positions. And it animates the individual, I guess I would say, small shapes or pixels, is how I like to think about it. And they all come together right over here. And yeah, that is pretty much it. So my foreground and my background together, you can pretty much get that lovely kind of look. I know this video was all over the place, but I was really excited by this project, so I thought I should share it with you guys. Hopefully you guys picked up a thing or two, and if you did, let me know down in the comments. But definitely check out Cavalry's YouTube channel if you're interested in playing around with motion graphics in Cavalry. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Have a good one. Cheers.